An injured puppy crawls to a police officer holding something in its mouth. When the officer understands what's in its mouth, he's shocked. Minutes later, his discovery is so cruel it leaves him speechless. First off, if you're anything like us and love animals, hit that subscribe button now so you don't miss a single heartwarming story. Thanks! Now, back to our story. The rain was coming down in sheets on the dark streets of Chicago, turning the asphalt into a slick black mirror reflecting the blurry glow of streetlights. Officer Mike Sullivan pulled up the collar of his soaked uniform as he made his usual nighttime rounds. At 45, Mike had seen it all on patrol, but something about tonight felt different, like the very air was thick with foreboding. That's when he spotted it, a small, dark shape moving hesitantly along the sidewalk. Approaching cautiously, Mike made out the form of a little dog, no bigger than a cat, limping noticeably. The animal, a scruffy little mutt with wet black fur, was carrying something in its mouth with determination. "Hey there, little fella," Mike called out softly, crouching down so as not to scare the animal. The dog stopped, shivering with cold, its big, expressive eyes fixed on the officer. Mike noticed how its ribs were visible beneath its soaked fur, a clear sign of days, maybe weeks, of hunger. The puppy limped towards him, still holding tightly to what Mike now realized was a folded piece of paper. There was an almost human intelligence in the way the animal looked at him, as if pleading for help. "What do you got there?" Mike gently extended his hand. To his surprise, the puppy dropped the paper into his palm, then sat down and began licking its injured paw. Careful not to tear the wet paper, Mike unfolded it under the streetlight. His heart quickened as he recognized a child's handwriting, shaky but determined, that had scrawled an address: Elm Street Warehouse, 276. "Who sent you, little guy?" Mike muttered, watching the dog now leaning against his leg, seeking warmth. Something about the situation set off his cop instincts. In 20 years on the force, he'd learned to trust his gut, and right now, it was screaming that something wasn't right. Mike grabbed his radio and called dispatch. "This is Sullivan. Need an address verification." While he waited for a response, he wrapped the puppy in his jacket, noticing how it snuggled gratefully into his arms. "Sullivan, that address is a textile factory. Owner, Tony Oliveira. No incidents. On record," came the reply over the radio. Mike frowned, thoughtful. A textile factory wasn't a typical place to find an injured dog carrying a note written by a child. He looked down again at the puppy, now asleep in his arms, exhausted. "We're gonna find out your story, little buddy," Mike decided, walking towards his patrol car. The rain kept falling, but now it seemed to carry a greater purpose, as if washing the streets clean to reveal long-hidden secrets. As he drove through the wet streets, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that this little mutt had crossed his path for a reason. The puppy woke briefly, licked his hand as if to say thank you, and fell back asleep. On the passenger seat, the paper with the address seemed to weigh a ton, carrying with it a mystery Mike was determined to unravel. The city lights reflected in the puddles, creating a kaleidoscope of colors that danced across the night. Mike knew he was on the verge of discovering something important, something that would change not only his life, but the lives of many others. What had begun as just another night on patrol was about to turn into a journey that would test not only his courage, but also his humanity. The factory loomed like an imposing shadow against the night sky, its dark windows resembling empty eyes, silently watching the deserted street. Mike parked the patrol car a discreet distance away and checked the address on the damp paper again. The little mutt, who he was starting to mentally call Champ because of its courage, perked up its ears, alert. "Stay here, buddy," Mike whispered, settling the puppy on the seat with his jacket. The dog let out a low whimper of protest, but obeyed, its eyes intently following the officer's every move. Approaching the main gate, Mike noticed a faint light coming from a side window. For a factory supposedly closed at this hour, there was something strange in the air. The sound of the rain muffled his footsteps as he made his way to the reception door and rang the bell. After a few tense moments, hurried footsteps echoed from inside the building. The door opened, revealing a middle-aged man with graying hair and thin-rimmed glasses. His smile seemed like a poorly fitted mask over an expression of nervousness. "Good evening. How can I help you?" asked the man, who Mike immediately identified as Tony Oliveira, the owner. "Officer Mike Sullivan," he introduced himself, flashing his badge. "We're doing a routine check of the area. Could you explain why there's activity at the factory at this hour?" Mr. Oliveira adjusted his glasses with fidgety fingers. Yes, of course. We're on a tight deadline for an important delivery. Some employees volunteered to work overtime." Mike nodded slowly, his trained eyes picking up on every small, nervous gesture the man made. That's when he heard it. A muffled sound, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. A child's cry. "Would you mind if I took a look around the premises?" Mike asked, maintaining a casual tone that contrasted with the growing tension in his chest. "Now, but it's so late." Mr. Oliveira ran a hand across his sweaty forehead. "Maybe it would be better to come back tomorrow during normal business hours." "I insist," Mike said firmly. "It's standard procedure." Reluctantly, Mr. Oliveira stepped aside, allowing Mike to enter. The interior of the factory was partially lit, the large sewing machines casting distorted shadows on the walls. The smell of new fabric mixed with something else, an odor of reheated food and sweat. "This way," Mr. Oliveira indicated, trying to steer Mike towards the administrative area. But the officer had already noticed a door in the back, partially hidden by stacks of fabric. And more importantly, he had noticed how the owner kept casting nervous glances in that direction. "That area is part of the inspection too," Mike declared, suddenly changing direction. Mr. Oliveira moved to block him, but stopped when he saw the determined look on the officer's face. "There's nothing there," the owner insisted, his voice trembling slightly. "Just old stock." Mike was already halfway to the door when another sound reached his ears, the shuffling of small feet and muffled whispers. His heart quickened as he realized that the wet note in his pocket might be more than a coincidence. The little mutt hadn't just found a random piece of paper. It had delivered a cry for help. With a swift motion, Mike reached for the doorknob. Mr. Oliveira stepped forward, his hands outstretched in a gesture of pleading. "Please don't..." But it was too late. The door swung open, and what Mike saw inside that room made his blood run cold. Under the dim glow of fluorescent lights, about 10 children, none older than 12, were seated at small makeshift workbenches. Their delicate fingers manipulated needles and fabric, while dark circles under their eyes marked their young faces. Upon seeing Mike, they froze like startled little animals, some dropping the needles they held. A taller girl, with long black hair pulled back in a messy braid, stood up slowly. Her dark eyes shone with a mixture of fear and hope. Mike recognized in her a natural leader, someone who, despite her young age, carried the weight of responsibility for the others. "Are you all okay?" Mike asked softly, stepping into the room. With his hands held out to show that he posed no threat, Mr. Oliveira remained paralyzed in the doorway, his face a mask of defeat. "We are now," replied the girl with the braid, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm Luana. It was my note that you received." Mike felt his heart clench as he realized that his suspicions were correct. "The puppy. Is he yours?" A small smile lit up Luana's tired face. "That's Shadow. He showed up here a few weeks ago. We shared our food with him, even though we didn't have much. He was the only one who managed to escape to get help." The other children began to approach timidly, as if Mike's presence represented a light at the end of a long tunnel of darkness. A smaller girl, who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, clung to Luana's hand. "How long have you been here?" Mike asked, his voice controlled despite the anger that was starting to bubble in his chest. 3 months, Luana replied, her eyes momentarily lost in painful memories. Mr. Oliveira brought us from the orphanage. He said we would be adopted, that we would have a family. Her voice trailed off. But it was a lie. Mike turned to Mr. Oliveira, who had leaned against the wall, seeming to have aged 10 years in the last few minutes. You have a lot of explaining to do. I didn't have a choice, the man stammered. The factory was going bankrupt. The debts were piling up. When I heard about the orphanage, there's always a choice. Mike cut him off sharply. He turned back to the children, softening his expression. You're safe now. I'm going to call for backup and... A sharp bark interrupted his words. The little black mutt had managed to get into the factory and was now running, still limping, towards Luana. The girl knelt down, hugging the dog as silent tears streamed down her face. He's our hero, she said, burying her face in the puppy's damp fur. I tried to send notes with him several times, but Mr. Oliveira always stopped him, until tonight. Mike realized there was more to this story. Much more. As he radioed for backup, he watched as the children gathered around the dog, some smiling for the first time since their arrival. Amid the sadness of the situation, a little mutt had become the symbol of hope they so desperately needed. The rain kept falling outside, but inside the factory, something was beginning to change. Mike knew that a long journey was just beginning, a journey of justice, recovery, and most importantly, healing. As he waited for his colleagues to arrive, he made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't rest until he saw each of those children in a safe and loving home. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to the channel. Continuing 3 months earlier, the Holy Hope Orphanage breathed the tranquility of a Sunday morning. The autumn sun filtered through the stained glass windows of the old mansion, transformed into an orphanage, painting the floor with soft colors. Sister Cecilia, the director, was tidying her desk when she heard a knock on the door. Come in, she said, adjusting her glasses on her nose. Tony Oliveira appeared in the doorway, impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit. His cordial smile and the expensive leather briefcase under his arm emanated an aura of respectability that he had carefully cultivated over the years. Good morning, sister, he greeted her, sitting down in the chair offered. As we discussed on the phone, I'm here to meet the children. My wife and I have always dreamed of having a large family. Sister Cecilia smiled, her heart warming with the possibility of a better future for her little ones. You said you might adopt more than one child? Yes, Oliveira replied, leaning forward with calculated interest. Actually, we were thinking of 3 or 4. We have a large house, resources, and a lot of love to give. Outside the office, Luana was sweeping the hallway, as she did every morning. At 12 years old, she had already learned to distrust overly generous promises. Something about the well-dressed man bothered her, although she couldn't explain exactly what. The following weeks were a whirlwind of visits, paperwork, and smiles. Mr. Oliveira appeared regularly, always bringing gifts and stories about the wonderful home that awaited them. His supposed wife was always traveling for work, an excuse that no one questioned, too eager with the prospect of the adoptions. Luana watched everything with growing apprehension. One afternoon, while he was talking to some children in the courtyard, she noticed how his eyes assessed the little ones in a strange way, almost as if he were choosing fruit at the market. You're very observant, he said, surprising her by turning around suddenly. And you seem very responsible too. You know, I'm thinking of taking you first to help take care of the others when they arrive. Luana's heart skipped a beat. After years at the orphanage, she had developed a strong protective instinct for the younger ones. The idea of leaving them alone scared her, but the possibility of being able to continue taking care of them in a new home. They will really come later? She asked, her dark eyes fixed on his. Of course, dear, he replied, his smile not reaching his eyes. "You have my word." A week later, Luana and 3 other children left the orphanage with Mr. Oliveira. Sister Cecilia wept with joy, believing that her little ones would finally have the home they deserved. In the following weeks, more children were taken away, always with the same promise of a loving family waiting. The reality that awaited them, however, was very different from the golden dreams that had been sold to them. Instead of a welcoming home, they found workbenches instead of toys, needles, and thread. Mr. Oliveira's paternal smile had turned into a stern mask that tolerated no mistakes or complaints. Sitting at her workbench that first night, Luana held back tears as she taught the younger children how to sew buttons. In her heart, a promise began to form. She would find a way to save them, no matter how long it took. It was then that, weeks later, a little black mutt appeared in the factory yard, as if sent by fate. The factory quickly transformed into a hub of intense activity. Police cars, ambulances, and social workers arrived one after the other, their lights flashing against the rain-soaked walls. Mike stayed by the children's side, who huddled around Luana and little Shadow like a group of frightened chicks. "You were very brave," Mike told Luana, as a kind social worker distributed blankets and hot cocoa. "How did you manage to convince the dog to deliver the note?" Luana's eyes shone with a mixture of pride and affection as she stroked the puppy's head. "Shadow is special. He always knew when we were sad and tried to cheer us up. One day, I saw him playing with a piece of paper, carrying it from one place to another. That's when I got the idea." "But Mr. Oliveira didn't let him stay here, did he?" Mike asked, watching as the puppy limped over to each child, offering comforting licks. "Not at first," Luana replied, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But we begged so much. We said he scared away the rats. Actually, I think Mr. Oliveira ended up letting him stay because he saw that we worked better when Shadow was around. He made us smile even on the hardest days." Across the room, Mr. Oliveira was being questioned by 2 detectives. His elegant suit now looked wilted, as did his haughty posture. Mike noticed how he occasionally cast glances in the direction of the children, his expression a confused mixture of regret and worry. A middle-aged woman, wearing a well-tailored blazer, approached Mike. "I'm Dr. Helen Martins from Child Protective Services," she introduced herself. "We need to start documenting everything and make the necessary referrals. Could you tell me exactly how you discovered this situation?" As Mike recounted the events of the night, from finding the puppy to arriving at the factory, he watched as Dr. Martins took detailed notes, occasionally casting compassionate glances towards the children. "And the orphanage?" Mike asked. "How did no one notice?" "We're already investigating," she replied, her face hardening. "Apparently, Mr. Oliveira built an elaborate network of false documents, but don't worry, we'll find out everyone involved." At that moment, a sharp cry cut through the air. One of the younger children had spilled her hot cocoa and was in tears, more from the shock than from the accident. Before any adult could react, Shadow ran over to her, ignoring his injured paw, and began licking her face until the crying turned into laughter. "That dog," Dr. Martins murmured, amazed. "He seems to understand exactly what everyone needs." "He's more than a dog," said Luana, approaching with a new cup of hot cocoa for the little one. "He's our 4-legged guardian angel." Mike felt something tighten in his chest as he watched the scene. Amid all that terrible situation, a little mutt had become not just a hero, but a symbol of hope and unconditional love. As the children were examined by doctors and prepared to be taken to a temporary shelter, Shadow refused to leave their side, as if still keeping his mission as protector. "What's going to happen to him?" Luana asked Mike, her voice trembling slightly. It was the first time she had shown real fear since it all began. The new Dawn shelter was different from anything the children had known in recent months. Colorful walls decorated with children's drawings, toys scattered in the corners, and the smell of home-cooked food in the air created a welcoming atmosphere that contrasted drastically with the coldness of the factory. Mike had insisted on personally accompanying the group there, with Shadow nestled in his arms. The veterinarian had already examined the puppy, confirming that the injured paw would heal completely with a few days of rest and proper care. "Can the children keep him?" Mike asked the shelter coordinator, Mrs. Margaret Olson, a grey-haired lady with a gentle smile. She sighed, adjusting her gold-rimmed glasses. "Unfortunately, we're not allowed to keep animals here. It's the health department regulations." Luana, who was nearby organizing the younger children's belongings, froze upon hearing this. Her hands began to tremble slightly as she folded a small T-shirt. "But I promised to take care of him," Mike interjected, surprising himself with the quickness of the decision. "I can bring him for regular visits, if that's allowed." Mrs. Olson's face softened. "Well, supervised visits aren't against the rules. And considering the special role of this little hero." "That's right," exclaimed Pedro, one of the younger boys, approaching with bright eyes. "Shadow is our hero. He has to be able to visit us." Other children began to gather around them, their voices merging into a chorus of pleas and arguments in favor of the puppy. Shadow, as if he understood that he was the center of the discussion, sat down and tilted his head, his big eyes going from one face to another. Okay, Mrs. Olson laughed, raising her hands in surrender. "We can arrange regular visits, but first, let's take care of you little ones. Dinner is almost ready, and then we have warm beds waiting." As the children were guided to the dining room, Luana remained behind, her eyes fixed on Shadow. Mike realized there was more to her hesitation than just concern for the dog. "You're safe here, Luana," he said softly. "Mrs. Olson and her staff are good people, and I promise to bring Shadow to see you whenever possible." "It's not just that," she murmured, nervously fiddling with the end of her braid. What if more kids need help? How will we know? How will we help them without Shadow?" Mike felt his heart clench. Even after everything she had been through, Luana's first thought was for other children who might be in danger. Crouching down to her level, he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Now it's our turn to be the heroes," he said. "The police are investigating everything, and I promise we'll find any other child who needs help. But now you need to focus on recovering, on being a kid again." Silent tears began to stream down Luana's face. Can I give him one last hug?" Mike nodded, and Shadow immediately jumped from his arms into Luana's lap. The girl buried her face in the dog's soft fur, whispering words of affection and promises to see each other again. The puppy licked her tears, as if trying to say that everything would be okay. The scene moved even Mrs. Olson, who discreetly wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her blouse. At that moment, everyone understood that Shadow wasn't just a dog that had helped in the rescue. He was a symbol of hope, love, and courage that had forever changed the lives of those children. A week after the rescue, Mike was at his desk at the police station, buried in piles of documents and reports. Shadow slept peacefully in a makeshift bed next to his chair, his paw already almost completely healed. The puppy had adapted surprisingly well to police life, quickly becoming the police station's favorite mascot. "Sullivan, you need to see this," said Captain Roberts, approaching with a thick file in her hands. Her normally serene face showed signs of concern. "The investigation into Mr. Oliveira has revealed something much bigger than we imagined." Mike adjusted himself in his chair as she spread documents across his desk. They were records of bank transactions, printed emails, and, more disturbingly, a list of other orphanages in different cities. "He wasn't acting alone," Captain Roberts continued. "We found connections to at least 3 other businessmen and—" She hesitated, lowering her voice. a high-ranking official in the Department of Social Services. Mike's heart raced. So there are more children, possibly, but now we have a bigger problem. Someone is trying to bury the investigation. Two important witnesses suddenly refuse to speak, and crucial documents have started to disappear. At that moment, Shadow raised his head, his ears perked up. Footsteps approached the hallway, and soon Dr. Martins from Child Protective Services entered the room, carrying her own file of documents. "You won't believe this," she said without preamble. "One of the rescued children, little Anna, who's 8, isn't an orphan as we thought. We found records showing that she was reported missing 2 years ago in Pittsburgh. Her family never gave up looking for her." Mike felt a wave of conflicting emotions: joy at the possibility of reuniting a family, anger at the extent of the scheme's cruelty, and renewed determination to uncover the whole truth. "We need to act fast," said Captain Roberts, "before more evidence disappears, but we have to be discreet. If we alert those involved too early—" "Maybe we don't need to be so discreet," Mike interrupted, an idea starting to form in his mind. "What if we used the media to our advantage? Once the story becomes public, it will be much harder for them to cover everything up." Dr. Martins nodded, slowly. "Public opinion would be our ally, and with the pressure of the media, other witnesses might feel encouraged to speak. But we need to protect the children," Captain Roberts reminded them. "No direct exposure of them." "I have a better idea," said Mike, looking at Shadow, who was now sitting attentively, as if he understood the importance of the conversation. "What if we told the story through our little hero, a stray dog who saved children from illegal labor? It's the kind of story that touches people's hearts without exposing anyone." Shadow barked once, as if approving the plan, making the 3 adults smile despite the seriousness of the situation. "I think our little friend agreed," said Dr. Martins, stroking the puppy's head. "And we can use this to call attention to the need for greater oversight in orphanages and adoption processes." As they discussed the details of the plan, Mike received a message on his cell phone. It was a photo of Luana and the other children, at the shelter, all smiling around a large poster they had made for Shadow. The poster said, "Our Hero," and was decorated with colorful drawings of paw prints. Looking at the photo, then at the puppy beside him, and finally at the documents scattered on his desk, Mike felt a growing certainty. What had begun as the rescue of a group of children was about to turn into something much bigger. The headline of the morning newspaper grabbed attention right on the front page: "Four-legged hero, stray dog saves children." The photo of Shadow, sitting proudly next to Mike in his police uniform, occupied the center of the page. The puppy seemed to smile for the camera, his story touching hearts throughout the city. "It's perfect," said Clara Santos, the journalist, who had written the article, watching the reactions of people who stopped to read the newspaper at the corner newsstand. "Look how everyone stops to read, and social media is exploding with shares." Mike and Dr. Martins watched the scene from inside the car, parked discreetly across the street. Shadow was in the back seat, his ears alert to every movement. "We've already received 3 reports since the article was published this morning," commented Helena, checking her tablet. "People who suspected similar situations but didn't know who to turn to." The strategy was working better than they expected. The story of the brave little mutt who saved children by carrying a note in his mouth had captured the public's imagination. More importantly, it was encouraging people to speak up. "Sullivan," Clara's voice interrupted them as she approached the car. "You need to see this. A lady just approached me. She worked at the Holy Hope Orphanage 2 years ago and says she has important information about other cases." At that moment, Helena's cell phone rang. Her face turned serious as she listened. "Anna's family is on their way," she said after hanging up. "They'll be here tomorrow from Pittsburgh. We need to prepare the children, especially Luana." She and Anna have become very close." Mike nodded, thoughtful. The prospect of separating the children who had bonded during difficult times was painful, even if it was for a happy reason like a family reunion. "Can I come with you to talk to them?" Clara asked gently. "Not to publish, of course. But maybe I can help tell the story in a way that makes them understand that sometimes saying goodbye can also be something beautiful." Shadow barked softly from the back seat, as if approving the suggestion. The puppy had developed an impressive instinct for judging people's character, and his positive reaction to Clara didn't go unnoticed. At the shelter, they found the children involved in a painting activity. Their faces lit up upon seeing Shadow, who immediately began distributing affectionate licks. Luana, however, realized that something was different. "It's about Anna, isn't it?" she asked, her voice low so that her friend, who was painting happily on the other side of the room, wouldn't hear. "You found her family." Mike admired the girl's maturity once again. "Yes, Luana, they're coming here. Tomorrow." "She'll be able to go home," Luana completed, a brave smile fighting against the tears in her eyes. "You know, I've always prayed that we would all find a family. I guess sometimes prayers are answered in ways that are different than we imagine." Clara, who was observing the scene, discreetly wiped away a tear. She had covered many stories in her career, but there was something especially touching about the wisdom of that 12-year-old girl. "What about you, Luana?" Mike asked softly. "Have you been thinking about your future?" Before she could answer, Shadow jumped into her lap, licking her face as if he wanted to remind her that she wasn't alone. The gesture drew a genuine laugh from the girl, echoing through the room and causing other children to approach. The next morning dawned with a soft winter sun. At the shelter, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Anna, dressed in her best blue dress, sat restlessly while Luana braided her hair carefully. "Do you think they'll still recognize me?" Ina asked in a low voice, her little hands nervously clutching the fabric of her dress. "Of course they will," Luana replied firmly, although her own heart was heavy. "You're impossible to forget, kiddo." Mike arrived early with Shadow, who immediately sensed the tension in the air and began his round of consolation, visiting each child with special attention to Anna. The puppy had become extraordinarily sensitive to everyone's emotions. Shortly after 9 o'clock, a car parked in front of the center. Mrs. Olson was the first to spot them through the window, a middle-aged couple, the woman holding a worn teddy bear, the man carrying a small, faded pink backpack. "It's them," Anna whispered, recognizing the bear that had been her inseparable companion in early childhood. Her legs were trembling so much that she could barely stand. The moment the door opened seemed to happen in slow motion. The woman, Sandra, Anna's mother, entered first, her eyes anxiously scanning the room. When her gaze met her daughter's, time seemed to freeze. "Mom," Anna's voice was barely a whisper. "My little one." Sandra dropped the bear, crossing the room in faltering steps. The hug that followed was one that seemed to want to make up for all the lost time at once. Anna's father joined them seconds later, enveloping them both in his strong arms, silent tears streaming down his face. Luana watched the scene from afar, feeling a complex mixture of joy and sadness. Shadow, sensing her anguish, leaned against her legs, offering silent comfort. "Look, we brought Beery," Sandra said, retrieving the bear from the floor. "He's been waiting for you all this time." Anna hugged the bear, burying her face in its worn, synthetic fur. Then suddenly, she turned and ran to Luana, grabbing her hand. "This is my sister, Luana," she declared, with a certainty that surprised everyone. "She took care of me all this time. And that's Shadow. He saved us." Anna's parents approached Luana, their faces overflowing with gratitude. Sandra wrapped her in a tight hug, whispering, "Thank you," repeatedly in her ear. You can visit whenever you want," said Anna's father, his voice choked with emotion. "Our house will always be open to you, Luana, and to the little hero too," he added, smiling at Shadow. At that moment, Clara, the journalist, who was discreetly documenting the reunion, realized something crucial. This wasn't just a story about a rescue or about denouncing irregularities. It was a story about how bonds of love can be formed in the most improbable circumstances, and how those bonds can survive and grow even after separation. Mike watched everything with a lump in his throat, especially when Anna insisted on saying goodbye to each of the children individually, promising that she would come back to visit. The police officer noticed how Luana maintained a brave smile, even when her hands trembled slightly as she hugged Anna one last time. "You'll find your family too, Luana," he whispered, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes, the family we find isn't exactly what we imagined it would be." Shadow barked softly as if agreeing, and for the first time that morning, Luana allowed some tears to escape. But they were different tears now, not just of sadness for Anna's departure, but also of hope for a future that finally was beginning to seem possible. The story of the little hero Mutt had spread like wildfire throughout the city, and now it was reaching national proportions. At the police station, Mike watched in admiration at the wall of his office, where dozens of newspaper clippings and printouts of online reports formed an impressive mosaic. Shadow, now a little fatter and with shiny fur, slept in his personalized bed, a gift from the police officers at the station. 3 more confirmed reports, announced Captain Roberts, entering the room with a thick file. "And this time, we managed to get documents that prove the connections with that official from the Department of Social Services." Clara, who was interviewing Mike for a follow-up report, looked up from her notebook. "And the most amazing thing is how the community is mobilizing. Do you know how many emails I get per day from people wanting to help? Hundreds!" Mike's phone rang. It was Dr. Martens. "You need to see this," she said, barely containing the excitement in her voice. "I'm sending you a document we just received." A former employee of the adoption system kept copies of everything for years, afraid to report it. Shadow's story gave her the courage. As Mike opened the email on his computer, Shadow suddenly woke up. His ears perked up. Seconds later, familiar footsteps echoed in the hallway. Mrs. Olson from the shelter appeared in the doorway, accompanied by a couple Mike didn't know. "Mike," Mrs. Olson began, her face lit up with a warm smile. "I want you to meet Richard and Teresa Mendez. They're retired social workers and we want to talk about Luana," Teresa completed, her kind eyes shining with contained emotion. Mike's heart quickened. Shadow, who was usually cautious with strangers, approached the couple, wagging his tail in a friendly manner. Teresa immediately crouched down to pet him, earning enthusiastic licks in response. "We've been following the story from the beginning," Richard explained, his deep voice laced with emotion. "Teresa and I always wanted to have children, but we couldn't. We dedicated our lives to helping other children through our work. When we retired last year, something seemed to be missing. When we saw the article about Luana," Teresa continued, "how she took care of the other children, her strength, her compassion, something touched our hearts in a special way." Clara, who had stopped typing to observe the scene, struggled to contain her own tears. As a journalist, she had learned to maintain emotional distance from her stories, but this one had become too personal. "We've already spoken with Mrs. Olson and Dr. Martens," Richard said. "We know the process is long, that we need to go through evaluations, but we want to give Luana a home," Teresa completed. "A home where she can finally just be a child, where she can grow up surrounded by love and—" A joyful bark from Shadow interrupted her. The puppy was running between the couple and Mike, as if trying to bring them closer, his tail wagging frantically. "You?" "No," Teresa smiled. "Our yard is big enough for a dog too. I mean, if his current owner agrees to regular visits." Mike felt something warm spread in his chest. It was as if all the pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. Looking at Shadow, who now sat between him and the couple like a small, furry mediator, he knew that another miracle was about to happen. The shelter's garden was especially beautiful that afternoon. Mrs. Olsen had made sure that all the flowers were well cared for the meeting. Luana, sitting on a wooden bench with Shadow beside her, nervously fiddled with the end of her braid as she waited. "You're going to like them," Mike whispered, who was standing near the bench. "Shadow already approved, and you know he's never wrong about people." Luana tried to smile, but her hands were trembling slightly. For so long she had been the strong one, the protector, always putting the needs of others before her own. Now for the first time, it was she who needed to trust and allow herself to be cared for. Teresa and Richard entered the garden, carrying a picnic basket. The idea had been Teresa's, an informal meeting, without the pressure of a closed room. Shadow immediately ran to greet them, breaking the initial tension with his enthusiastic licks. "We brought some sandwiches," Teresa said softly, approaching. "And also," she hesitated for a moment before taking something out of the basket, "I thought you might like this." It was a photo album, its cover decorated with small, colorful butterflies. Luana took it carefully, as if it was something precious. "It's empty," Richard explained, sitting down on the other side of the bench. "We thought we could fill it together, start our own story." Luana opened the album, its blank pages seeming to promise endless possibilities. On the first page there was only one photo, Teresa and Richard in front of a welcoming house with a large yard, exactly as they had described. "It's our home," Teresa said. "There's a room waiting for you if you want. And that tree in the yard? Perfect for a tree house." I never had a tree house," Luana murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "We could build one together," Richard suggested. "I have some experience with carpentry, and of course, we'd need to make a special entrance for Shadow to be able to climb up too during visits." The mention of the dog made Luana look up. Shadow had settled at her feet, as he always did when he sensed that she needed support. You really want him to come visit?" "Of course we do," exclaimed Teresa. "He's part of your story, Luana, and we want to know and love every part of you, including your furry friend here." Something inside Luana began to melt. That wall that she had built over the years, brick by brick, to protect herself from disappointment and pain. Can I ask something?" she said, her voice gaining a little more strength. "Anything, dear," Teresa replied. "Why me? There are so many children." Richard and Teresa exchanged a look before he answered. "Because when we read about how you took care of the other children, how you were strong and brave, but also gentle and protective, we knew that you were the daughter we always dreamed of having. We're not looking for a perfect child, Luana. We're looking for you exactly as you are." The tears that Luana had been holding back finally overflowed. Teresa opened her arms hesitantly, and, for the first time in a long time, Luana allowed herself to be just a 12-year-old girl needing a mother's hug. The police station's meeting room was packed that Thursday morning. Captain Roberts was standing before a board covered in photos and documents connected by colored lines. Mike, Dr. Martins, Clara, and representatives from the district attorney's office occupied all the available chairs. Shadow, as always, kept his post beside Mike. "Thanks to the reports we received after Shadow's story," Captain Roberts began, "we were able to map the entire network. The scheme wasn't limited to Mr. Oliveira's factory alone. We identified connections with 3 other companies and," she paused significantly, 5 orphanages in different states. "And most importantly," added the district attorney, Mr. Paul Martinez, "we have concrete evidence of the involvement of the Deputy Secretary of Social Services, Robert Peterson. The copies of documents provided by the former employee are irrefutable." Clara typed furiously in her notebook, but stopped to ask a question. And the children? Were you able to locate them all? So far, we've identified 28 children. In similar situations, Dr. Martins responded, consulting her notes. 16 have already been reunited with their biological families, like Anna. For the others, we're working with a network of dedicated social workers to find suitable homes. Mike smiled as he thought of Luana, who at that moment must be helping Teresa decorate her new room. The adoption process was proceeding with surprising speed, thanks to the dedication of everyone involved. But the story doesn't end here, Mr. Martinez continued. The impact of the case has led to a complete review of adoption procedures across the country. New guidelines are being implemented with greater oversight and transparency. Shadow, who had dozed off during part of the meeting, suddenly raised his head and wagged his tail. Seconds later, the door opened, revealing Mrs. Olson with a radiant smile. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I thought everyone would like to know. The shelter has just received a significant donation. We'll be able to renovate all the facilities and hire more staff." "Who's the donation from?" asked Clara, already imagining another angle for her report. "Actually, it's several donations. After we published the list of the shelter's needs, along with Shadow's story, companies and individuals began to contribute. But the most touching thing is the letters that come with the donations. People telling us how the story made them rethink their own lives, their ability to help." Mike felt something wet on his hand, Shadow licking his fingers, as he always did when he sensed he was emotional. The little mutt who had arrived limping on a rainy night hadn't just saved a group of children. He had triggered a wave of transformations that continued to grow. "I just received more news," announced Dr. Martins, looking at her cell phone. "The Senate Human Rights Committee is proposing a law to strengthen the protection of children in the adoption process. They're calling it the Shadow Act." A murmur of approval went through the room. Clara, who had promised herself to maintain professional composure, discreetly wiped away a tear. "I think our little hero deserves a party," suggested Captain Roberts, smiling at the puppy who now sat proudly, as if he understood that they were talking about him. "And I know exactly where we should have it." The shelter's garden had never been so festive. Colorful balloons danced in the gentle afternoon breeze. Decorative banners stretched across the space between the trees, and tables arranged in a circle displayed a feast of treats and soft drinks. In the center of everything, a large banner proclaimed, "Celebrating our heroes, big and small." Shadow, wearing an elegant blue bow tie, a special gift from Mrs. Olson, circulated among the guests like a perfect four-legged host. Each child who passed by him received an affectionate lick, each adult an enthusiastic tail wag. Luana, radiant in a new dress chosen by Teresa, helped distribute slices of cake. Her new adoptive parents chatted animatedly with Mike and Clara, sharing plans for the treehouse that was already beginning to take shape in the yard of their new home. "Look who's here," announced Mike, pointing to the gate. Anna and her parents entered the garden, the girl running immediately to hug Luana. Shadow barked happily, jumping around the two reunited friends. Anna was different, her cheeks fuller, her eyes shining with a joy that only family love can bring. "We brought a surprise," said Sandra, Anna's mother, carrying a decorated box. Inside it there were handcrafted collars, each with a small engraved plate. "Shadow, our hero." "One for each day of the week," Anna explained proudly. "So he'll always be pretty for his visits." The other children who had been rescued from the factory were also present, each with their own story of a new beginning. Some had found their biological families, others were in the process of adoption, but all carried on their faces the mark of renewed hope. Dr. Martins approached the center of the garden, asking for everyone's attention. "Today we're not just celebrating a rescue," she began. "We're celebrating how a small act of courage can trigger a wave of transformation, thanks to Shadow and To all of you, dozens of children have found their homes, laws are being changed, and people are learning not to close their eyes to those who need help. Clara, who was photographing the event for her latest report on the case, captured the moment when Shadow, as if he understood that they were talking about him, sat elegantly next to Luana, his posture emanating an almost human dignity. "And there's one more piece of news," announced Mrs. Olson, her eyes shining with emotion. "With the donations we received, we're going to start a visiting therapy dog program here at the center. And guess who's going to be our special consultant?" Shadow barked, making everyone laugh. Mike crouched down to pet the puppy's head, remembering that rainy night that seemed so distant now. Who could have imagined that a small injured mutt would become the catalyst for so many positive changes? Teresa and Richard approached Luana, wrapping her in an affectionate hug. "Ready to go home after the party?" Teresa asked softly. "Home," Luana repeated, savoring the word. "Yes, I'm ready. But can we bring a piece of cake for when Shadow comes to visit us tomorrow?" 6 months had passed since the party at the shelter. The yard of the Mendez house flourished under the spring sun, with climbing roses beginning to climb the walls of the treehouse that Richard and Luana had built together. A specially designed ramp allowed Shadow to go up and down at will during his regular visits. On that Sunday afternoon, the family was gathered in the yard. Teresa served fresh lemonade, while Richard adjusted the new bookshelf they had installed in the reading nook of the treehouse. Luana's idea, who had discovered a passion for literature. "Look who's here," announced Luana, running to open the gate. Mike entered, with Shadow trotting happily ahead of him. The puppy, now an elegant young dog, still maintained his playful and loving nature. His long-heeled paw no longer showed any sign of the old injury. "Brought a surprise," Mike said, handing Luana a folded newspaper. It was Clara's latest report on the case. The headline announced, "Shadow Act completes 6 months. Over 100 children benefited." Below, there was a photo of the little hero with his bow tie, surrounded by smiling children at the shelter. "And that's not all," Mike continued, sitting down with the others in the shade of the big tree. "The shelter's therapy dog program has already inspired other shelters to do the same. Shadow's going to be very busy as a consultant," the puppy barked, as if agreeing before settling in Luana's lap. The girl, who now wore her hair shorter and had freckles from the sun on her nose, finally looked like a child her age. Happy, carefree, and loved. "Anna called yesterday," Luana said while stroking Shadow's soft fur. "She's going to be in the school choir. And guess what? Her family moved closer. We'll be able to see each other every week." Teresa and Richard exchanged emotional smiles. Seeing their daughter flourish, make plans, dream, it was everything they had wished for. Luana's room, once an empty space waiting to come to life, now overflowed with personality. Drawings on the walls, books piled on the small table, and a special bed for Shadow in the corner, for his naps during visits. "You know," Luana said thoughtfully, looking at the sky through the branches of the tree, "sometimes I think about how everything changed because of a little puppy lost in the rain." "He wasn't just a puppy," Mike replied softly. "He was love, courage, and hope, all wrapped in a furry package." Shadow raised his head, his intelligent eyes going from one face to another as if he understood that they were talking about him. The mutt who once roamed alone on the streets had become a symbol of how small acts of kindness can transform the world. On the horizon, the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The gentle breeze swayed the branches of the tree, making the leaves whisper stories of hope and new beginnings. In the treehouse, the new bookshelf promised thousands of adventures to come. In the heart of each person present, the certainty that families are not made only of blood, but of love, courage, and sometimes of little paws that leave huge marks on our lives. Luana hugged Shadow, burying her face in his soft fur. "You didn't," "Just save us that night," she whispered. "You taught us that heroes can come in all sizes." The little mutt responded with an affectionate lick, his tail wagging happily. In the peace of that Sunday afternoon, under the protective shade of the big tree, a family different from all and equal to all celebrated the love that had united them, a love that began with a note in the mouth of a brave puppy on a rainy night.